Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 43 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. As the curtain rises, a man's voice can be heard coming from the darkness, chanting the names of Welsh towns. As the lights slowly come up, we see a middle-aged man standing in a small village hall. He is wearing an old overcoat and an ill-fitting dark suit that is polished with wear. On the back wall of the hall hangs a soiled linen poster, which reads, "The Fantastic Francis Hardy, Faith Healer, one night only." The man standing on the stage is the very same Frank Hardy, the eponymous faith healer in Irish playwright Brian Friel's play of the same name. The play was first performed in New York in 1979, but was not an initial success, closing after only 20 performances, despite featuring no less a star than James Mason in the title role. The Guardian suggested in Friel's obituary in 2015 that American audiences could not take the total absence of action or storyline in the play. Though I think that we will come to see that there are in fact many stories in this rich, quietly devastating drama. Brian Friel is of course one of Ireland's most acclaimed dramatists. He wrote 24 plays between 1960 and his death in 2015, including Philadelphia Here I Come, Dancing at Lunasa, and Translations. He's been likened to an Irish Chekhov. In fact, he produced several versions of Chekhov's own plays. But the comparison may arise from the fact that 14 of his plays are set in the same fictional Irish village, which he called Ballybeg, where he portrays universal family dynamics against the backdrop of Irish culture and history. Faith Healer has been revived many times since its first run in New York, notably at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin in 1980, as well as at the Royal Court, the Almeida, the Donmar, and more recently as a production filmed during COVID lockdown in an empty auditorium at the Old Vic in London in 2020 with Michael Sheen in the title role. It was also due to open at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin 2 years ago when the first COVID lockdown shut down rehearsals. Happily, the show did finally make it to the Abbey stage this past December and January, which itself is something of a landmark, in that it was directed by Joe Dowling, who had directed the original production at the same theater more than 40 years ago. So I am terribly excited to have the chance today to talk with Joe Dowling himself about a play that he has a unique knowledge of. Welcome, Joe. Thanks for joining me all the way from Minneapolis on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be with you.
I should do a proper introduction to you. Joe Dowling was born and educated in Dublin, where at the age of 28, he became the youngest artistic director in the history of the Abbey Theatre. He followed his time at the Abbey running the Gaiety Theatre in Dublin before moving to North America, where in 1996 he was appointed artistic director of the prestigious Guthrie Theatre in Minneapolis. In his 20 years in charge at the Guthrie, he directed more than 50 productions, including Shakespeare, American classics by O'Neill, Miller, and Williams, as well as Irish plays, of course, including Faith Healer in 2009, which he not only directed, but also appeared in. Which means, I think, Joe, that you've actually directed the play 3 times now and acted in it as well. So my first question has to be, what is it that keeps bringing you back to this play?
Well, I think it's a remarkable play. You know, the idea that it doesn't have story and doesn't have drama makes no sense if you actually analyze the play. There are quite a number of dramatic moments in the play, and of course the climax and the finale of the play is the most extraordinary coup de théâtre, when you have a real sense that the faith healer himself is willingly going to his death. But the important thing about it is the thing that keeps drawing me back to it are the characters and the richness of Friel's writing within those characters. Each of them has their own separate identity, but as a group, you really do feel that even though they're all on stage separately, because it's 4 monologues, you do feel a connection and an interaction between them that comes through in the text. It's remarkable. It's complicated text, not easy from an actor's point of view, from a director's point of view, but fascinating work, and very much Friel's masterpiece.
We'll get to the characters and how they're tethered together, because you have that sense of them being tethered as a unit together, don't you, very strongly. But I wondered also, given the length of time that you've been involved with this, and you were involved in the very first production at the Abbey, I wondered what your memories are of working with Brian Friel at the time of first doing the play. And then how do you feel about it differently or not as the years have gone by?
Well, the first production in 1980 was on the foot of a failure. As you say, it had opened on Broadway with James Mason playing the lead and his wife, Clarissa Kay, an Australian actor. Because James Mason was cast, I think the producers felt this was going to be a selling point because, stars on Broadway, not recognizing that this play really demands a very, very detailed level of acting and a very detailed level from the audience of listening and hearing and picking up on clues from one monologue into the next monologue. And they put it into a very large theatre. I think it was in Circle in the Square. So the play just didn't resonate with that audience. And I think that for Brian, that was a huge disappointment. I mean, enormous. I was directing Aristocrats, another of his really fine plays at the Abbey at the time. I had just become artistic director, and I was very keen to develop a strong relationship with Brian Friel because he was the premier dramatist in Ireland at the time and remained so for many years. So when the play failed in New York, Brian came back to our rehearsals in Dublin of Aristocrats, and quite frankly, he was devastated by the fact that the play had not succeeded because he knew he had something very special. He knew that this play was, in a way, a much richer play than many of the things that were happening on Broadway at the time. So when I said to him, we'll do it at the Abbey, his immediate reaction was no. No, he said, I don't want it done for a while because I couldn't take two failures one after the other with this same play. So I thought, well, that's that. We won't do it. So obviously he'd have to support it. And about a week later, or less than a week, he came back to me and he said, if you can persuade Donal McCann to play Frank Hardy, I'll agree to it being done at the Abbey. And the reason that I was excited by that is McCann was one of the most exciting actors of his generation in Ireland. Complicated man, difficult personality in many ways, but could produce on stage a kind of magic. So I talked to McCann and he read the play and immediately said yes. So that's why we were able to do it. And the play opened in 1980 to the most extraordinary reviews, an astonishing box office. I mean, lines around the block. So suddenly a play that had seemed to be dead and was written about in many, many studies of Friel as a turning point in the understanding of Friel as a playwright, because the play was a very different play to anything he'd written before. And it was a play that many Irish playwrights followed. There were a number of monologue plays written as a result. Not all as good, it has to be said. Though I think writers like Conor McPherson and Enda Walsh have taken the monologue form and done great things with it.
It's fascinating to hear about Donal, and there's certain alignment, I think, with Frank Hardy himself in the character, it sounds like, but also the form, which is distinctive, and we'll talk about that. But before we get into that, for listeners who don't know the play, Joe, I wonder if we could give them a brief synopsis of who these characters are and what the main events of it are.
Well, on a basic level, it's about a faith healer, a man who goes from village hall to village hall in Wales, Scotland, and occasionally in England. But he says in the early part, never Ireland because of me. And he's Irish, born, he says, in Kilmeedy, County Limerick. But we have to take everything that's said in the play somewhat with a grain of salt because there are a lot of contradictions. Each of the three characters have memories of what happened, and each of those memories, in fact, contradicts many areas of what the others say. But I think what all three agree on was that as they went around in this van with Frank Hardy, the faith healer, mostly drunk, and muttering these Welsh and Scottish names over and over again, Aberader, Abereran, Llangrana, Llangorig. And he says that he used to do that I must get the quote right here, for the sedation of the incantation. Friel's use of language is extraordinary in this play.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
He really sculpts every word. But the action of the play basically is they're going from village to village where, as Grace, Frank's wife, says in her monologue, sometimes we'd have barely half a dozen. And Frank says that the faith healing, occasionally it worked. He says, oh yes, occasionally it did work. But 9 times out of 10, he didn't cure anyone. And he talks in the play about that when he did, he had a sense of exultation. And that exultation wasn't that he was doing good, giving relief, spreading joy. No, the exultation was because then he felt whole in himself. Then he felt complete. So it's a really interesting psychological study of this man who had some kind of gift. There was a gift. He did occasionally cure, but who also in his personal life was falling apart and who literally, by the end, hanging on for dear life. Grace comes along, the character, and we realize that here is a woman destroyed by the absolute adoration and love and passionate need for this man, right through until his death, and who nursed him. She says, I nursed him, sustained him. And so we've got 2 diametrically opposed views of a single relationship. The third character is their manager, Teddy. And Teddy was at one point a manager of vaudeville music hall acts, including Miss Mulatto and her pigeons, and a whippet called Rob Roy, who took sounds from a bagpipe. and Teddy, of course, is a wonderful creation. It's this cheerful, chappy, cockney character who will survive. He is a survivor in a way that neither Frank nor Grace were. Frank, spoiler alert, it's very clear from the beginning of the play that Frank is doomed. And by the end of the play, he has invited death. Because by the time we get to the end of the play, and by the time we get to the end of his first monologue, they have decided that Scotland and Wales, they're no longer going to do that circuit.
They're making no money there, are they?
And Teddy explains it when he says, you've cured them all here, he says.
Yeah.
Let's go to the lush pickings of Ireland. And Frank says, I agreed to go because they wanted to go, and I was also sick of the places they were going to. Grace says she didn't want to go. Teddy didn't want to go. It was Frank who wanted to go. Teddy has a different story. So all of them have different sort of realities. But the basic reality is they did go to Ireland. And they end up in Ballybeg in County Donegal, this Ballybeg, Ballybeog, the Irish word for small town. And they end up in Ballybeg in a bar where they meet with a group of local farmers. And Frank offers to cure one of them who has a bent finger. And the finger, he says, when he finishes holding it, the finger was whole. And then there's a man in a wheelchair. And the expectation as the night goes on with a great deal of drink, the expectation is that Frank will be able to cure the man in the wheelchair. But now we know that 9 times out of 10, it doesn't work. So we're not expecting that he's going to be able to do that. And he's not expected to be able to do that. But of course, that leads to violence and his end. The structure of the monologues is such that we get completely engaged with Frank in the first place, and we believe everything he tells us because we've nothing else to go by except his word. And then Grace comes along, and we start to hear there's a whole other story here. And it's fascinating when you compare the two. And then Teddy comes along offering a third version of very vital areas of their lives, including the birth of a baby. And then we get the final monologue by Frank, who tries to set the record straight. The subtext of it is, you may have heard other stories from other people, but I'm here to tell you what's really true. And we're left with this ambiguity, we're left with questions. And to say that there's no drama in it, it boggles my mind, having lived with the play for 40 years.
No, it's crazy. It paints this picture of the 3 of them going around Wales and Scotland in this beat-up van to low-rent locations in dusty halls with only a few people turning up, and occasionally he has some success. But all 3 of them describe a few key emotional events that happened in their lives. And we get different versions of those events, essentially. Some of the events that they describe, one is the last scene where they go back to Ireland in the pub that night. And we'll come to that later as to what actually happens there. But there's also a famous night, isn't there, in Wales, where Frank apparently cures 10 people at once. So it's some unprecedented success of his. And a local farmer who was lame and he's supposedly cured gives them £200 in gratitude. And Frank and Grace blow it by going and staying in a 4-star hotel. So there's that incident is described. And at some point, Frank's mother or father dies and he goes back to Ireland. But then one of the most central and emotionally powerful events in the play is that Grace gives birth to a stillborn baby at some point in Scotland. And there are different accounts for what happens there, which we'll also come to. As you say, the play is structured in 4 monologues, Frank first, then Grace, then Teddy, then Frank again. So we got a sequence of 4 of them on the stage. They're never on the stage together. So there are 2 things I wanted to start to talk to you about, Joe, now, which is firstly the structure, and secondly, about faith healing itself. From your point of view as a director, is it more challenging to create drama from monologues rather than with the live interaction of characters? Is this why the initial reviewers would go, okay, this is not so exciting because I'm just getting stories told to me as opposed to enacted with characters?
Well, I think undoubtedly, I mean, when you have 2 characters on stage, you can raise the dramatic stakes much more easily than you can when you're being told the story.
So why would Friel do this? Why would Friel structure it this way? What does he gain by doing this is, I guess, my question.
I think like the Japanese movie where you see people have the same memory, but they tell it from a different point of view each time. You can't necessarily do that when the two characters are talking to each other. But when somebody's telling you the event, like, for instance, the event of the baby being born, Frank says, I would like to have had a child, but she was barren. That's how he describes that whole event. He completely dismisses the idea that this is even a real event. Gracie describes the event and says Frank was there, that Frank put a little cross up and said prayers, and they buried the child in the field. Teddy comes along and tells us that not only was Frank not there, but that when he knew she was about to go into labor, he disappeared up the hill, very businesslike, as if he was going somewhere, Teddy tells us. And these are the 3 distinctly different views of a very dramatic event. And you can't do that if it becomes dialogue between people. So I think Friel's idea was that in so much of Friel's play, if you look at Dancing at Lunacy, you look at Philadelphia, Here I Come, 2 plays that sort of bookend, in a way, his career, memory is a hugely important part. So here's Friel in Faith Healer saying memory is a central part of this. And the only way I can really identify the difference that people have, we can all have very different memories of the same event. The only way I can do that is if, in fact, there's no one to interrupt or contradict. So each of the monologues, there isn't a contradiction. In the final monologue, Frank doesn't quite contradict, but he tries to explain why there might be differences, but he also insists that he's right. So I think that the form, in a way, was demanded by what the intention of the play was. There are many intentions in the play, but I think this whole issue of memory and how memory is really a very subjective thing, and a thing that's related to one's own psychology as opposed to there being a uniform memory of events, because we all remember things differently.
The way they interpret or remember these events indicates something about the way they feel about these events, of course.
Yes.
It's something emotional or psychological is revealed as a result. And we'll come to some of those specifics. But in terms of the structures, you say also it's interesting that yes, obviously it's easier in some ways, as you said, Joe, to create drama when characters are interacting live on a stage. But actually, I think there's real drama in storytelling as well, isn't there? The way they paint the pictures of these scenes, it's extraordinarily vivid.
Yeah.
The language is wonderful. So actually, we are conjuring pictures of these events.
Yeah.
And the other thing is you get this sense of suspense, don't you? You said earlier about how we just know that some of this is not going to come to good.
Yeah.
In a way, because otherwise, why would you tell us a story?
Right.
So there's this sort of natural suspense in the perspective that they're talking about the past. They're going to relay us some story. So we know there's got to be something important's going to happen.
And I think you talk about storytelling. Storytelling, of course, is absolutely within the Irish tradition, the oral tradition of storytelling. It's the scéalaí, the storyteller who went from place to place and told stories of heroes of old. So it's an integral part of the Irish tradition. And Friel is using that in a way that's highly sophisticated, but at the same time, at its root lies this desire to communicate through narrative. And I think he's kind of honoring that Irish tradition in this play.
You were saying earlier, mentioned Conor McPherson. I was thinking about the Weir, where essentially this is a series of people telling stories, isn't it? And actually, we were in Dublin not that long ago, and my wife commented she was at a conference, and they were out afterwards in the pub, as one does. And her observation was that the conversations she was having were not a sort of conversation; they were a series of stories being told. She somehow was trying to suggest and identify that this is something to do with being Irish.
Yes.
The way they communicate is telling stories, not in a kind of asking questions back and forth dialogue.
Yes.
Anyway, that's a diversion slightly. Talk about faith healers. This whole idea of a faith healer is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, Frank admits that it only happens 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, it doesn't happen 9 times out of 10.
Doesn't happen 9 out of 10. Yes, exactly. Sorry. But it does happen 1 time out of 10 or occasionally. And it's based on some idea of real people who have this gift of so-called the cure. Where does this come from, this whole idea that faith healers really have some power?
Well, there was, in the 1960s and 70s in Ireland, there was a man who did go round and was reputed to be, and he was the 7th son of a 7th son, which Frank refers to in the play, that in fact was where the gift came from. I think, of course, it's about the faith healing. Frank can't define it.
No.
He calls it a gift. And then he says, how did I get involved? He says, well, as a young man, I chanced to flirt with it and it possessed me. And then he said, and the other extreme is, am I a con man? So he's not certain. Grace says, faith healing, I never understood it. I tried, but I never did. Teddy says, this man had no talent, but he has brains. And when he was on form, what his brains could do for him. So nobody in the play can define what it is. And I think it's largely because the faith healing aspect of the play, is really a metaphor for the creative artist, for a creative artist who sits and tries to create out of nothing. The notion that the faith healer has an equivalency in an artist, whether it be a writer who suddenly gets the muse strikes and they can write the play, or paint the picture, or the actor who one night goes out and, gives a performance that he or she feels, I now know why I do this. Whereas 5 nights out of the 6 that actor's on stage, it's a job of work, but suddenly the magic works. And I think that there's a metaphorical relationship between Friel's faith healer and what the creative artist, and the impact that an artist can have on the people around them. And, we know that from history and living with somebody who's got that creativity, but that creativity, when it happens, has to be something completely personal and not shared. And it's a brilliant metaphor when you think about it, because nobody can describe it. Has it a religious context? Faith in what, he says? Faith in me? Faith in faith? What is this thing? And how does it manifest itself? And the same can be said of a great play. How does that idea occur, and how does it manifest itself? Or of a great painting, how did the painter actually manage to do it? But of course, the collateral damage very often are the people around them. And I think that's what he's saying in this play.
I'm so glad you said that, because there are a couple of clues, aren't there, in the play? When Grace, in her monologue, she talks about visiting a doctor, and the doctor asks her what her husband's occupation is, and she says he's an artist.
Yeah.
And of course, Frank called it a performance, that he was getting ready to perform as an actor, as you just said, gets ready to perform. And also Grace talks about how Frank created stories about the characters he was potentially healing, and these characters became fictitious in a way in his own mind.
They were his inventions.
Yes, there's definitely clues that there's something metaphoric going on here. When he describes in Wales They has the success, and somehow there's this otherworldly sense of what's joining these people together in that hall in the way that maybe it happens in the theater. What is the alchemy of live theater? And there's something mesmeric about it, isn't there? And of course, the thing about Frank is that it's both a blessing and a curse.
Oh, absolutely. It's largely a curse.
Yes, because he has no power to actually summon his power. He cannot summon it. It only comes unbidden, if it comes at all. He doesn't know when. He knows when it won't come, which is even worse. There's an analogy, isn't there? Teddy talks about the artist as well. He talks about Laurence Olivier as an actor and how there's this famous story, isn't there, of Olivier coming off stage after a fantastic performance of Othello, I think it was, and people saying, how did you do it? And he said, I have no idea how I did it. And that's the problem. I can't reproduce it because I don't know where it comes from. In the same way that Frank the Faith Healer can't replicate this at will.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole thing of performance is hugely important in the play. Because even when Gracie says, I wish you could have seen him, Teddy would put on his record, the way you look tonight, the ironic way you look tonight to a group of people with disabilities. And then Frank would appear and she said, oh, yes. And I used to say, you lucky woman. Now, she had just described to us horrific details of how he behaved. And then she says, he was magnificent. So the sense of a great artist, a great actor coming out on stage, and this is where the marriage of the play and the actor in our first production of it at the Abbey was so important. And that's why Friel's idea that McCann could give you that sense that when he walked out on stage, you were aware of something magnificent and extraordinary. The reason the play works, if it works at all, is because of the actor involved. The actor has to be right. There have been productions of it where the actor was a good actor, no question, but it needs more. It needs somebody who has a kind of madness, a kind of just that thing that defines a star in the theatre. Somebody whose very presence is mesmeric and you can't take your eyes off them.
It's almost that you have to be able to believe that there is something otherworldly possible from this person.
Yes.
Even against all rational thinking, you still have to believe. And actually, that's one of the themes in there, that it's a bit about the act of healing itself. How much depends on us believing that we can be healed. It's an act of faith in two directions, isn't it? And I was thinking that's, again, interesting analogy to theater, because we have to suspend, as an audience, suspend our disbelief. We have to bring our faith to the theater for this transaction of sorts to work. I'm talking about grace because, as you said, the price that people around pay. So Frank is charismatic and he's got this potential magnificence, but he's also horrible to Grace, isn't he? He's cruel and he drinks and he pays little attention to her at times. What is it about Grace? Why does she stay with Frank all through this?
Well, one could ask that of many relationships. Why does somebody stay when the relationship, in fact, is as sour as it seems to be? But Grace goes home at one point, and her father was a judge, and her mother was in and out of mental hospitals, and it was Bridie, the housekeeper, who raised her. So Grace comes from a very dysfunctional family. And when she goes home to see her father, because she realizes at that point she has to leave Frank, the thing is just too awful. And the father has had a stroke, and she goes to see him and realizes, I cannot ever be part of this. There's something about the relationship with Frank and the life with Frank which has a life in it. There's life. Yes, they fight all the time. Yes, there's the damp mattresses and the awful van, but it gives her an energy and it gives her a purpose to be with this man and to love him in a way that her life never had before. The father says, you betrayed your mother and you killed her. You killed your mother because you ran off with the mountebank. A great word, the mountebank. But I said you'd come back. I said, give her 6 months and she'll come crawling back. And that arrogance, that sense of entitlement, that sense of somebody who cannot see beyond the judicial bench and the meting out of penalty or reward, but there's no human connection there between her and the father. And with Frank, awful as it is, there's a very real human connection, even if they're both fighting like cats and dogs. That's something. So Grace is a very damaged person because of the upbringing and because of the background. And Frank, she says, she's sort of looking at her now with that sly look of his, with a smile on his face that just draws her to him. It's a hard relationship to accept. If you look at it from the perspective of what we're dealing with now in the 21st century and notion of consent and relationships, this is a very hard relationship for audiences to buy into. And it's Friel's genius that you actually come away with some psychological understanding of why these people are still together. But it's not an easy relationship to define.
Well, I think it's interesting you're saying about where she comes from. So it's very unlikely. You learn that she trained to be a lawyer. Her father was a judge. And clearly what's happened is she's rejected all these conventional options. And in fact, there's a theme about, I suppose, between the rational and the ordered. They talk about the father being obsessed with order, and she abandons all that for the chaos of life with Frank.
Yeah, because it represents something real. But the other thing one has to place in here, and this play was written in the mid-1970s.
It's a very difficult time for Ireland, obviously. And Grace is from Northern Ireland, and Frank, wherever he's from, because he talks about being from Limerick, but there's also evidence that his father was in Dublin and so on. But that whole notion of these two people from very different traditions, very different backgrounds, coming together in some kind of relationship that leads to violence and death. I wouldn't want to overdraw that analogy. I wouldn't want to create that he's writing a political play in the same way that he wrote in Translations or that he wrote in Freedom of the City. But there is no doubt that she's from Northern Ireland. He says Grace Doddsmith from Scarborough, or was it Knaresborough? But she tells us that she's from Big House in Northern Ireland, which suggests to anyone in Southern Ireland and to most people, the Big House in Northern Ireland would have been a Protestant house. So they're subtle, these distinctions, but they're there in the play. And you have to recognize that this is a very Irish play, and it's dealing with those kind of divisions as much as it is with the personal.
So why would he say she comes from Yorkshire? Why does he tell that lie?
Well, what she says at the end, I'm one of his inventions too. He's inventing her. He's also wanting to make her seem distant and cold, and somebody from England, of course, is compared to somebody from Ireland. So there's a huge ambiguity here. He says she's from Scarborough, Knaresborough. And then in the final monologue, he says, I never met her father, the judge. I had a letter from him, but I never met him. So he tells us that the father was a judge, which acknowledges that her story might indeed be true.
Yes. From what you've just said, I don't know, maybe he's disguising the fact that she may be a wealthy Protestant from Northern Ireland to anybody else or himself even, because that would be some sort of betrayal, maybe.
It would diminish him somewhat. If she's from a place called Scarborough or Knaresborough, and he's not sure which it is, then he says they all sound so alike. She becomes run-of-the-mill. If she's from a very distinguished legal family in Northern Ireland, the sacrifice she made to be with him is much greater. So there's an element of his ego comes into play here. But I'm just saying that for an outside observer, a Southern Irish man and the Northern Irish Protestant, it's a theme that he comes back to again and again.
We were talking earlier about where she comes from and her father's influence and driving her away. But also there's references to her mother. You mentioned earlier about her mother going in and out of a mental hospital. As with all the ambiguities of this play, possibly there is another perspective, from Frank's perspective, because he talks about how she threatens suicide, that if he ever leaves her, she'll kill herself. And when we see Grace in her monologue, and particularly at the end of her monologue, she is not well. And Frank says at one point, there was more of her mother than her father in her. And what she says at the end is she misses him desperately. But what she says is she wants him to cure her in a way, doesn't she? She says to heal her. How I want that man to come across that floor and put his white hands on my face and still this tumult inside me. He's a healer for her too, either originally when they first met or throughout their relationship. She's needier than we might first imagine, that he treats her terribly, but actually she's clinging to him.
Oh, absolutely. No question. She needs him. And again, it goes back to that upbringing and to the lack of emotional connection with a mother or a father, with a housekeeper. And she does commit suicide. So when Frank says, if you leave me, now, when she goes to the doctor and he says to her, you have been through a traumatic experience, Mrs. Hardy. but you're a lawyer, you must get over it. You must be rational and reasonable. And of course, she knows that's not possible for lots of different reasons. The relationship is as much, she needs him as much as he needs her. I mean, it's a completely mutual, and they mutually destroy each other. But when she goes to the doctor, she witnesses his death. She says, I watched it from the upstairs window. And Teddy was asleep, but she comes in and, Teddy, wake up, something terrible has happened, something awful. And she recognizes immediately that this is the end of Frank. I mean, anybody would witness something like that, no matter how needy she was in the past. And now she's sitting in this bedsit in London, working part-time in a library. I mean, how dull can that be compared to being in that van and sitting at the table and people giving them £200 in Clanblethian and all of those events that motivated her life and created some kind of tension and energy. Now she says, and I knit and I read, I listen to the radio. I mean, these are very sedentary occupations compared to what her life has been. So that combined with the trauma means that when she says, I need that man to open that door, she needs to live again. And she can only do that in the context of Frank.
Yes, and he's no longer there, as you said, and witnessing his violent death. I want to talk a little bit about Teddy, because in simple terms, we've talked about this central relationship is the core of the play, and he may seem a peripheral character to the main act, not just Frank as the main act, but Frank and Grace together as the main act. But his attachment to them is wonderfully drawn, isn't it? I mean, why does Teddy stick with them through thick and thin?
Well, he kind of tells us, because he says, no, he was no great artist. No, in fact, he was a mediocre artist. But when his brains left him alone, when he did what he did, I mean, Teddy's career, such as it was,
Yeah.
if we're to believe him, I mean, we don't believe him, of course, because he talks about Miss Mulatto being able to draw the pigeons from 140 pigeons, 20 to a box, I should know. Frank says Miss Mulatto and her 3 pigeons. So there's a big difference between that and managing someone like Frank. And when these big events happened, like the one in Clanblethian, when he cured 10 people, and Teddy describes that with such reverence and such understanding of the extraordinary nature of what Frank has just done. You can see why he is a holy man to Frank, and he gives purpose to Teddy's life. Otherwise, Teddy would be, as he now is, living in a
room drinking beer
and remembering stories that never happened.
Yeah. I mean, they talk about how he was waiting he thought there'd be a big payout someday, but it's not really about that, is it? It's about his attachment to them, but it's not just to Frank, is it? I mean, the suggestion, of course, is that he's in love with Grace as well.
He says it. I mean, and he also says that he's in love with Frank. I mean, and I don't think he means that in any kind of romantic, sexual way, but he certainly loves both of them. And he says what Frank does after he cures the boy's finger, he turns to look at Teddy, and he said, I can't describe it, but it was that look that he gave when he knew he was about to cure someone. And suddenly Teddy, after years of, oh my Jesus, what are you going to do, Teddy boy? What are you going to do? When he sees her in the red dress, suddenly that's cured. He no longer has these overwhelming, passionate need for a relationship with Grace. But he says, I love both of them. And he falls asleep because it's peace. And Frank knows at that point that he's going to go out and be killed. And he cures Teddy before he does that. Because he does not want Teddy, he knows Grace is never going to look at Teddy. He doesn't want Teddy to live with that need after Frank is gone.
It's a fantastic moment, isn't it? Because the way Teddy describes, he's watching Grace in total love and says she looks fantastic in her red dress, and they're together in the pub this last night. And Frank sees him watching her. And then Teddy turns and sees that Frank has clocked the way that he's looking at Grace and says, I understand. And somehow this allows Teddy to be free of this thing what he's got for Grace that he can admit now, but that it's never going to go anywhere. It's a fantastic psychological moment in the way it's described. So he, as you said, he goes to bed drunk and happy. But it's also heartbreaking at various times, isn't it? Because he's very much the third wheel. This sad picture of him that night we described when in Wales, where he cures 10 people. Grace and Frank take off in the van without a thought for Teddy, and then are gone for 4 days in a hotel in Cardiff and just have left him behind, abandoned him.
This was 4 days before Christmas. So they left him for Christmas in the snow. He says, I opened the door and now it's snowing. And so he has no money and he's in Llanblethian in Glamorganshire at Cockney and they're gone. And he says, no malice intended. No malice intended. Just a bit thoughtless, a little bit thoughtless.
When they're in Scotland, there's a detail that Grace and Frank are sleeping in the van and he's just kipping in the field.
And that's, again, the contradictions that are there, because Grace says that she was told it was a beautiful place when the sun shone. But she says, but when we were there, it rained all the time. Teddy says, beautiful sunshine. The first time we'd seen the sun, and I didn't mind sleeping in the field because it was such beautiful weather.
This is a great segue, because I return to the theme of these unreliable narrators and memory.
Yeah.
How each of their accounts in their lives differs so significantly, particularly the memories of these two most dramatic events in the play and their lives. The time in Kinlochbervie in Scotland, the birth and death of the baby that you were just describing. The significance of Kinlochbervie is huge, isn't it, in the play? It's signaled as the play develops, because as we talked about, there's this regular chanting, repeating of the towns that they visit. And gradually through the play, Kinlochbervie is repeated more often, more frequently by all of them.
Yeah.
And it signals that this is where the most profound events occurred and the most profound disjunct between their stories also occurs. Yeah. And little things like the weather, as you just said, are indications that it's something to do with the psychologies of the way they remember this. Because as you say, Grace remembers it as nothing but raining and a thick Scottish mist. Teddy thinks it was sunny and lovely, and Frank describes it as a very beautiful, picturesque place with views across to Lewis. What psychologically is going on with the differences in their accounts of that particular event, of the birth and death of the baby in Kinlochbervie?
Well, I think that you've just said it. I mean, the baby was born in Kinlochbervie. 2 out of the 3 tell us that. The third one, in the litany of names, he ends up, and particularly in part 2, with Kinlochbervie being the sort of climax of his litany of words. He never describes anything about it except the sort of tourist board description that all 3 of them give. Kinlochbervie, about as far north as you can go in Scotland, very picturesque little place, but it's a tourist board version. It doesn't tell you anything other than we were there.
As you said, he never even admits that a baby was born or died, does he?
No. I would like to have had a child, he says, but she was barren. I mean, the cruelty of that line always strikes me. We have to believe, because Teddy tells us and Gracie tells us, 2 out of the 3 tell us a baby was born.
Yes.
And he calls her barren, which is such a terrible word. And it's a word he uses when he talks about the tune, The Way You Look Tonight. And as I moved among the crippled, the lame, the barren, he uses that word to describe people who would come to him for a cure. And then he says she was barren. There's a cruelty there that's just... And I think it's also the mesmeric quality of the word, Kinlochbervie. It has a kind of resonance that would appeal to Frank's sedation of the incantation.
But he's sedating himself, isn't he? It's a lie to himself, of course. So he tells the story where he says that he was there was when he had word that his mother was dying. He went back to Ireland. And the other 2 versions, no such thing occurred at that point. In fact, Grace says that it was his father was dying and it wasn't in Kinlochbervie, but he's basically conflating the 2. He's somehow, psychologically, he's substituting his mother's death for the baby's death, blocking it all out completely to himself.
Oh, absolutely. But he does that a lot. I mean, if things aren't exactly the way he imagines them or pictures them, they didn't exist. She says when he didn't cure people, those people didn't exist. She knew he was on a serious decline when the woman that he tried to cure, he met this woman in an off license, he tried to cure her arthritis and he failed. And instead of what he would normally have done was, that woman didn't exist, but he followed her home and told her he could cure her, kept telling her, until her son-in-law had to throw him out and threatened to get the police. It's at that point that Grace knows he's gone past a certain point where we have to go back to Ireland, because this will just get worse and worse and worse. But Frank for the most part, anything that doesn't fit into his narrative, he ignores and dismisses because he cannot face up to. And he says, my father was a sergeant of the guards in Reedy, County Limerick. But that's another story. And we never hear that story, except the moment when the father would look out through the bars of the barracks and look at him going to school. But that's not a memory that makes you think there was a very strong bond between father and son. And yet Grace says, and if he loved anyone, he loved his father. So the complications here that Friel is putting in front of us, we're trying to understand a man with a personality that's like Quicksilver. It's almost impossible to grasp him fully.
One of the things I was going to ask you is how acutely perceptive psychologically Friel is with these characters and the way they remember these events. So Teddy, who I think we possibly think is the most reliable account, but we'll come back to that, very hard to judge, says that Frank took off when the baby was about to be born and didn't come back till it was all over. And that Teddy actually was the one who was there supporting her and then helped bury the child in the field. And Teddy actually put a small cross on the place. In Grace's version, Frank actually is there. Frank is actually responsible for creating the cross and for saying some prayers over the grave. Why would Grace do that? Why would she attribute him being there and making the cross if he wasn't? When she tells it like that, immediately following her telling that story, she says, God, he was such a twisted man with such a talent for hurting. That would suggest some part of it knows he wasn't there.
Yeah.
And that's what hurts. So why does she tell us or the story that he was there?
Because the fact that the man she loved and lived with and believed in and adored and says he was magnificent could do something as cruel as that? Walk away when you know that your wife is about to have your baby? How could she have lived with herself and lived with him if she was ready to acknowledge that truth about him? Teddy, who, as you say, we have to believe, because Teddy describes the events in Kilknockburvey exactly the same way as Gracie, with the exception that it was he and not Frank that did it. So if we put those two parts of the puzzle together, we're now ready to believe Teddy's version. But psychologically, she would collapse and the relationship would collapse. She wouldn't have been able to carry on, but they knew they had to carry on. Because she says, after going back from the visit to Ireland, where she recognized that it wasn't just a rejection of the father, but it was a knowledge that she was part of Frank and the van and the wet mattress and all of that. And at that point is when the baby was conceived, exactly after she came back. So when the baby was born, she had nowhere else to go. Her father died before the year was out, and she had nowhere else to go. But how could she live with herself? The nervous breakdown and the suicide would have happened a lot earlier if she hadn't convinced herself that Frank was there and Frank helped her.
You're absolutely right, because it's so perceptive. It would be more humiliating for her to accept that the man she loves and stays with could have behaved this way.
Exactly.
That's not a story you want to continue to tell yourself. And in fact, that brings us back to that point you made at the very beginning about memory, how we construct memory and why we construct the memories that we do, because we do construct them in some form, don't we? And sometimes we remember things differently than other people, but also we create even a coherent narrative for ourselves, possibly to hide something we don't want to acknowledge. We create a truth about our lives. We're constructing stories about our lives all the time. This is part of what's happening, isn't it? This is part of what all three of them are doing when they tell us the stories in the way they tell us the stories.
But even on trivial matters, I mean, people have different memories. It doesn't need to be a cover-up. It is in some ways in Faith Healer, it's a cover-up, but it's also everybody arrives at a certain event with a different perspective, and coming out of that event, they'll have a different view of what actually happened from their perspective. As I say, it's such a theme in so many of Friel's plays, the whole notion of memory as a very faulty barometer of what actually happened. He goes deeper with it in Faith Healer because we're dealing with very flawed people. We're not dealing with anybody who has heroic qualities of any kind. And all three of them have to define themselves in terms that will allow them to continue. And when they can no longer define themselves in those terms. When Frank says, the very last line of the play, at long last I was renouncing chance. He had to do that ultimately because he couldn't live with all of the failures that his life had been. Grace at the end recognizes that without him, she can't carry on. The moment when Teddy goes, because it was just a professional relationship, that's all it was. It was certainly nothing more than that, was it? That's his last line, was it?
The more times he says, my one rule is it must have been a professional relationship, the more times you don't believe him, of course. And there's all that evidence, as we said earlier, he's in love with both of them, and it's far from professional.
But he couldn't survive if he didn't believe that.
Yes. That's about his identity, isn't it?
At the end, he asks us the question. And as I said to the actor when we were doing it the last time, it's not a rhetorical question. He needs to know. And he says, but it was a professional relationship. That's all it was.
That's how he defines his identity, and he doesn't want that to be challenged.
And he's the one who survives.
And as you said at the end about the last scene, then, as to what actually happens in this pub and how it unfolds, there are differences in the accounts of that as well, particularly between Grace and Frank. In Grace's telling, Frank volunteers to cure the man's finger. And in Frank's account, the man challenges him. And in Grace's account, the man with the wheelchair is already there, whereas Frank's account is that, and Frank knows, the important thing is that Frank knows that he's voluntarily going to put himself in this position, which could imperil him because he knows he won't be able to cure him. And then somehow his interpretation grants him more control, that he's voluntarily, Frank is walking into this.
He deliberately and consciously walks into it. He says McGarvey, the cripple who had been injured in an accident, had fallen from scaffolding, whether he actually was there, as Gracie says, or he wasn't there and they went to fetch him, is in some ways an incidental detail. The reality is that there was a man in a wheelchair. When Frank says he cured the bent finger, he knew instinctively that nothing was going to happen with McGarvey, with the man in the wheelchair. And he knew that the result of that, of him not curing him, was going to be a betrayal of these young men, because these young men were so invested now in his faith healing. He actually cured the young man's finger. So why wouldn't he cure McGarvey? And what a miracle that would be. And it's the barman says, there's nothing you can do for McGarvey. There's nothing no one can do for McGarvey. You know that. And Frank's response to that is, I know that. And if you don't cure him, the barman says, they'll kill you. And Frank says, I know that too. And the barman rushes from the room because he doesn't want to be there to witness it. And Frank says, I had to help myself to a drink. I thought about getting drunk. So there's a kind of calm has come into him at this point because he knows he can renounce chance now. He has certainty in his sights. And that certainty is death.
It ends the plague of doubts, doesn't it? And the uncertainties he's lived with.
It's certainty. It ends doubt. And the questions, he talks about the questions. And he finally says, and at long last, the questions were silent. He had stopped all those questions about who am I? What am I? How do I do this? Why do I do this? All the questions about his identity are gone. And now he knows that it's just him. And that wonderful last speech where he talks about everything had disappeared, just him and the wedding guests. The corporeal world had disappeared, and he's just there with these figures. It's an extraordinary piece of writing and filled with drama.
It is. It's beautifully described because you see this so vividly. It's a very dramatic, filmic even picture of them going into the yard, the back of the pub. It's just stunning. Well, I think we proved, have we not, Joe, that this play is full of story and drama. Thank you so much for this conversation. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend a play. This is going to be tough for you, I know, because you've directed so many great plays. Maybe there's one that is a personal favorite you have done, or another one that you'd love to do and haven't done yet. So is there one you might nominate?
Well, one from the Irish background that I think is a wonderful play is Tom Murphy's The Gigli Concert.
This is one I don't know, which is great. What is it about?
Tom Murphy he's now dead, but he, like Friel, was one of the definitive writers of the last 50 years in Ireland. And when I was at the Abbey, I was the artistic director of the Abbey, we did Gigli Concert for the first time. Again, it's a 3-character play, but it's about a man who wants to sing like Gigli does. And he goes to a therapist who's called a dynamitologist. I mean, it's a kind of a made-up name. And the man persuades him that he can sing like Gigli. It's got all kinds of levels and metaphors, but it's also, at a very simple level, it's a kind of an angry, very Irish play.
Is there faith healing going on there too then? Is there some magic?
There is a magic.
Convincing him that he can sing.
So it has a link with faith. Friel was a huge admirer of Tom Murphy's. They were great friends too, but he was a huge admirer of Tom. He used to say, if anyone will write the great Irish play of the late 20th century, it'll be Tom Murphy.
Well, if Friel was a fan, then I think it's worth seeking out. So thank you very much for that recommendation. That's brilliant. Thank you, Joe, so much for your time. And it's been a privilege to be able to speak to you today with your unique experience with this play. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
As the curtain falls, there is a telling phrase that Frank has uttered towards the end that lingers in the mind and expresses the deep-seated truth about our own need for faith and possibly healing. We existed only in spirit, only in the need we had for each other. The truth is distilled to the need we have with others who we can believe in and who might believe in us, perhaps so that we can also believe in ourselves. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter @theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.